to our show. Welcome to our show. It's a good show. Big, big shoe. It's really huge.
I'm Chaz Kangas. I worked once with Will Keenan, so you don't have to. And you're listening to Talkin Troma with Zack.
Big, big shoe. It's really huge. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Tromaville, and welcome to episode 13 of Talkin Troma with your host, me, Zack. The show where me and a special guest fight the forces of evil with holy water and hip-hop while watching a Troma movie, and then we pair it with a non-Troma title for a fantasy double feature. But first, let me introduce my special guest. He has been in the convention trenches with the Troma team. He has been a voice for indie hip-hop on the airwaves. He's a journalist. He laid down tracks with Colt Cabana, Mac Lethal, Childish Gambino, and many, many more. One of my favorite rappers with his newest album, Small Hours, out now. Let me introduce to you, Chaz Kangas.
Greetings from Tro, Minneapolis. So happy to be here. Big fan of the show.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, dude.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we go way back, as well as like a few past guests on the show. We met each other way back on the Troma message board days.
Yeah, a subsidiary of Tromaville.com. Where do you live? So,
I miss having a Tromaville.com email address.
Yeah. I miss how they used to tell you on the website or on the Troma VHS box art and DVD art to go to troma.com/home.
Yes.
Instead of just straight up troma.com.
I remember on the message boards, you were one of the more vocal posters on there. Always, always saying what movies you love. But what stuck out to me about you was you would also promote your rap albums that you were doing, or songs that you were doing. And I just thought it was unique because it was, a lot of Troma fans or filmmakers, but very few musicians unless they were in like a punk band or something. So I checked out your music back then, and then like even stuff like Two Girls, One Christmas would stand out to me.
Yes, the odds. Yeah, that's, it's interesting that Troma itself and a lot of the fans, I think part of it could just be the area of New York that a lot of the movies, especially like during the 90s era, would come from. A lot of that Lower East Side scene, which is such largely a punk rock scene. You have CBGBs down there, you had the Continental down there. And so there was like a shoulder to shoulder, like visible presence with, the punk rock aesthetic. And even that first wave of 80s nostalgia that happened in the mid 90s, people would have, and Troma would be such an accessible touchstone to it, as well as we talk about these movies as cult classics and feeling like you're part of that same cult, part of that counterculture with Troma and with punk rock. So I think that Troma generally has gone, and plus you have like the Go-Kart Records connection to like Terra Firma.
Yeah.
And I think like the hip hop connections that Troma has, kind of not with no intention at all, like not intentionally, but it's been sort of somewhat understated. Like you have a movie like Stuck on You that has the first appearance of rapping that's in cinema, like the first time you see rapping in a movie, and it's rabbis. But the first time you see like actual, since the advent of hip hop, rapping in a movie is in Stuck on You. And you look at something like Story of a Junkie, which has the first cinematic use of Grandmaster Flash and Melly Mel's The Message. It's wild that there are these direct, important, pivotal things that Troma has in the hip hop world, and how, like a lot of Troma's innovations, has gone unchampioned for so long. So I was happy to, as much as I can, bridge that gap or sort of make that connection within it. And I think that you have the people who aesthetically, especially now, who've discovered Troma through other means in different generations. And, it's and then I think there's a lot of kinship in the hip hop DIY aesthetic with the Troma aesthetic.
The one hip hop thing I always remember like Lloyd talking about was how the Fat Boys threatened to sue Troma over the Fat Guy Goes Nutsoid title. It was originally Fat Boy Goes Nutsoid, so I just thought that was kind of funny.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I forgot about that, but that's kind of they kind of had a point. I gotta say, like looking back on it, like years later, like I'm sure if Troma, if the movie was called LL Cool K Goes Nutsoid, like
Yeah.
or LL Cool J spelled JAY Goes Nutsoid, then LL Cool J might have had a point, or
Yeah.
if they called it the Furious Four Goes Nutsoid, and they'd be like, hang on now, like, yeah. But
especially when that movie came out, it's not like somebody at the Troma offices didn't hear about the Fat Boys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the biggest hip hop groups in the world at that point were essentially Run DMC, Houdini, and the Fat Boys. Like, yeah.
So. Just around the corner from the offices too. It's not like it's like, oh, it's a West Coast thing. Like we never heard about it.
Yeah, there's something that's bubbling up in Port Arthur, Texas. The Fat Boys. Like, no, like this is the most important counterculture movement happening in North America is happening in the same city. So on the same, like probably literally the same street too, when you consider the 42nd Street theaters and where stuff like Wild Style and Beat Street played in those days.
Yeah.
Crush Groove especially, like, yeah, it's like what, 1 year removed from Crush Groove and like probably same year as Disorderlies. Like that's while the Fat Boys were putting out movies.
Well, and it's pretty funny because jumping ahead quite a bit, but like looking at like the cast and crew of who worked on the movie we're going to talk about, a lot of them worked on like Crush Groove and the Run DMC Tougher Than Leather and stuff like that, which I thought was
the movie we're talking about is Femme Fontaine, Killer Babe for the CIA. No, I'm
yeah, the gunshots are part of the title.
Oh yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just thought that there was a good moment for a joke, which is true Troma, the Troma way of performing. Anyway, as you were saying,
I do want to know though, what was your first introduction into Troma movies?
All right, so we all have a certain age, I think, have that image of Toxie with the Toxic Crusaders and the USA Cartoon Express. And having the Toxic Avenger and Toxic Crusader comics on Marvel just popping up with ads in the same time in the back, when like X-Men and things started getting really hot. But I'd say like my major love affair with Troma began in the February of 2000. I remember the Hollywood Video on Central Avenue had just gotten Cannibal the Musical. And while it was the updated box art for it with the blue box, as the fans know it, the tape itself was the one from 96. So, and I was someone who was renting a lot of movies. I really like movies. I wasn't like looking like super outright the cinephile I would become, but I was someone who would really enjoy going to the video store, renting 2-3 movies a weekend, checking them out. So I rented Cannibal the Musical, and because I recognized Trey Parker from South Park. And I remember reading a little bit about Cannibal the Musical from a Rolling Stone article like a year or two prior, and seeing the Toxic Avenger pop up before the introduction of the trailer. Like, oh, hey, I remember that guy from when I was watching the USA Cartoon Express. And then I remember the trailers in order were, you had Sergeant Kabuki Man, Romeo and Juliet, Bugged, Frostbiter. I think there was one more.
The Rowdy Girls.
No, this was 96.
Oh, the 96?
Yeah. Rowdy Girls, Terror Firmer, and Citizen Toxie were the ones on the blue box, the proper tape from that. So this was, it was Frostbiter, Bugged, Kabuki Man, Tromeo. It's gonna get me.
I have this tape too, so I'm like trying to remember.
Going through the old mental Rolodex.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to the Two Guys Remember Movie Trailers on VHS podcast.
So Chaz, what were the trailers on?
Well, I remember about the SP tape versus the EP tape or SLP tape. But anyway, so point being, these were all movies I hadn't heard of that all looked so different from anything I'd ever seen. And I was like pretty blown away that these things that had such a cool, different aesthetic to it existed. And then there was the introduction from the Troma team itself, the one that has Lloyd Kaufman in it, and Jane Jensen, Tiffany Shepis, James Gunn as the Angry Boom Man, the role that catapulted him to greatness.
Yes.
And so watching that and being like, oh, what a cool introduction, what a cool thing that they have like this intro. And it really, at that point, felt like, oh, this feels like a kind of a cool universe. And prior to that, like I had recently gotten into a lot of the movies from 99 that were misunderstood that you didn't really get to see until they were on video, like Idle Hands and Jawbreaker, and just seeing that merge of horror and comedy that prior to that, my brain didn't really put together that you could like mix genres like that. So seeing Cannibal the Musical, and then the very next weekend I rented The Toxic Avenger and watched it with my mom, and the R-rated version. So, we got plenty of nudity, but didn't see a full head crushing. And I was just blown away that this horror comedy was just, full-fledged horror comedy. And so I was talking to some of my friends in school, and like my buddy Matt Amundsen, who is my best friend, he had seen Class of Nukem High about 6 months prior, and he was quoting the mayor character, Pat Ryan Jr. Was he Peter Bell Goody in Nukem High as well, or did he have a different name?
I think he had a different name.
Yeah, but he quoted him like, I don't give a what you think became a common thing in 8th grade at the Immaculate Conception recess. So the very next weekend, I rented Cannibal again, and I invited everyone over to watch it. And I'm like, there's something here. We gotta start seeing these things. And the local Hollywood Video didn't have Kabuki Man or a lot of these other ones, and Kabuki Man was one he really wanted to see. So the week after that, Matt went to Video Update, which was a chain that later became Video Stardom, and he found Kabuki Man in the action adventure section. And then this Video Update had something that I haven't seen at any other video store, a section called Requested, where they had piece of paper that you could write down movies you want to see Video Update carry. And then they'd get it, and then they'd put the movies that were asked for that they didn't have in this section called Requested. And it was a full section. It wasn't just a row. It was an actual viable
That's
series.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. So Matt was just sort of looking for anything that had the Toxie, the Troma logo on it, because it was 2 for 99-cent rentals at Video Update. And so he picked up Kabuki Man, and then lo and behold, in Requested, he found a little movie called Death by Temptation. And, we watched both those, were blown away by it. And then the snowball just started going, and suddenly being, the quest of what video stores can we go to? Let's walk through and see every single aisle, and you'd be surprised, things that would either outright have the Troma logo on it. And then we picked up Lloyd's first book, All I Ever Need to Know About Filmmaking, I Learned from the Toxic Avenger, and started making it a point to read and try to memorize all the names of the Troma titles, so that when we would go back to these video stores, we'd go through and we'd try to see which names do we recognize. So when we'd see even though there was no real viable Troma image on it, we'd find Feelin' Up in the comedy section, Monster in the Closet in the family section, Scream Baby Scream in the horror section, and we would just start seeing more and more of these, and it became almost trying to find Pokemon, trying to find Troma movies. And once in a while, you'd find ones that would have a whole bunch of the Troma team video releases with the yellow banner on them that made it really easy to find. And from there, the internet had such a connection to it in so many places, and Troma.com just had such a cool website at the time, and people really didn't have that cool of websites in 2000. And just, and then, then of course there's a message board there where we found, and the fact that Lloyd was just always so accessible. So at one point, my friends, we started making movies with just our VHS tape and our camera. And the first couple ones were improv. Then I made a feature film my freshman year, and we had a script for. And then just the fact that Lloyd was just so accessible, and it's wild to think about. And to this day, and it still is. I remember, my senior year of high school, when I was calling him to do to add a vocal thing for the rap album I mentioned. I called him and I got on the phone I called him from like my school payphone, like during lunch. And the fact that I could just talk to Lloyd Kaufman in the middle of the day. And I remember hanging up and everybody said, what was that? And I was just talking to Lloyd Kaufman. He knew who Lloyd was. So he said, okay, cool. Now I can get out of the way. I got to call Oliver Stone. And it's something very unique with Troma, knowing, to pick like your heroes, and you pick like, whose ideology, whose movement you get swept up in. And, whether you want to, the fact that it was, I don't even want to say an indoctrination, because so much of being part of the Troma team was the input and having your own ideas.
Yeah.
And so I think as well that there's something about Troma that is accessible to, there's such a mixture of like the very highbrow and the very lowbrow to make a nice little unibrow. And you have, the people who watch it solely for the blood and the guts and the camp and the nudity, and which is all well and good. And then you have those who watch it for the ironic reasons, the mocking reasons, the chances to riff on it. Then you have those who watch it for the aesthetics of like certain eras, the fact that like, here's something that couldn't otherwise exist. That's really why I think Troma movies, compared to so many of their contemporary other studios who would put out so many things on VHS and DVD, is you genuinely felt, whether you liked it or not, the Troma movies were someone's artistic vision being completed and being released. And again, whether they did a good job or a not so good job executing that vision, it was something done for the sake of creating something they really believed in. And I think it's hard when you're that young and you get so swept up in something like that, and wishing that there was more of that out there and more of those different things from different studios. Because a lot of them, and I'm not, it's a movie business. You do it to make money.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of ones you can tell it's like, okay, this was just, this is something that was put out to just try to be something like this, or this had a reason to try to deliberately be as offensive as possible, or this is out here just to deliberately be as shocking for shock's sake. Whereas like with the Troma stuff, when there'd be something, weird or potentially offensive, there would be an actual constructive reason behind it. Again, whether that execution was good or not is up for debate, but there's a purity of heart, I think, in Troma, and a genuine wholesomeness to how Lloyd and Michael operated that studio and released films. So long story long, that is how I got swept up and fully traumatized.
Well, it's funny that you and me have a very similar intro to Troma. I had a friend who rented that Cannibal the Musical from Hollywood Video, and I was a huge South Park fan, and he knew that I love South Park and basketball, so he said, hey, I'll bootleg this movie for you. Do you want me to leave the previews on? I think you might get a kick out of them. They're pretty weird. They're by this company called Troma. I was like, yeah, sure, why not? I did not know that was gonna change everything.
Yeah.
Like just so vividly. And then like seeing that trailer for Tromeo and Juliet the very first time, where it's like, what the hell am I seeing? And Motorhead is blaring, and you have the Kabuki Man car flip, which I didn't know what that was yet. And
you see this penis with the face coming up, and then you see like this pregnant belly that popcorn pops out of, followed by rats. And I think that's like with Troma movies, 9 times out of 10, you're going to find yourself saying, what the hell am I watching? But you're going to have a smile on your face while you're saying it.
Yes.
And I think that's like the main appeal and the main draw. And to be chasing these different experiences, like, Hollywood Zap is nothing like Igor and the Lunatics. There's such different movies that are under that Troma banner, even stuff from the same directors, like wild that, Class of Nukem High 2, Subhumanoid Meltdown, and Fortress of America were from the same director.
Yeah. It did. What was like the first time you realized that it's like, oh, all these movies aren't gonna feel the same?
Oh, so you're asking what's the first Troma movie?
Yeah.
No.
Not necessarily didn't like,
Yeah.
but you like, I know for me, I saw Cannibal, and then like Toxie and Toxie 3, and then I popped in Bloodsucking Freaks. And I was like,
honestly, yeah, for me, it was also Bloodsucking Freaks. Because even like, I saw Toxie, and the thing with Bloodsucking Freaks was one that I purchased, because I remember my Hollywood Video had it, but it didn't have the Troma collector's edition that had the intro from Lloyd Promise on the back. That wasn't there. And there was it was the old Vestron release of it. So I purchased that and Redneck Zombies. I think it was just those two, my first like blind Troma purchase. And I put in a $5 order. No, I take it back. They had Eve's Beach Fantasy a later time that I went. I didn't special order that. So
that was actually another one that like I think I had a double. Like I bought Bloodsucking Freaks and then I rented Eve's Beach Fantasy. And so it was like, all right, fellas, let's all watch Eve's Beach Fantasy. It's like, this is not a very fun movie to watch with a room full of your friends.
Well, I remember someone on the Troma team gave me this little nugget that Eve's Beach Fantasy was actually a hardcore pornography film that just had all the hardcore pornography eliminated from it.
Yes.
So, but I remember like watching it as a kid and thinking, this is a romantic comedy, and like not quite getting the eroticism, just getting more caught up in the whimsy.
Yeah.
But yeah, Bloodsucking Freaks, I remember watching because, for number one, there's no scenes of freaks sucking blood. Number two, there's just I didn't watch it as a dark comedy. I was watching it ready for some like sort of slapstick, but there's just like there's a darker undercurrent to it than there is something like a Surf Nazis Must Die.
Yeah.
And I remember just like watching it and being, especially like, the ending. Prior to that, every Troma movie I saw, it had like a unquestionably very happy ending. And Bloodsucking Freaks, it's like, and I'm sure everyone who's hearing this podcast now has seen Bloodsucking Freaks, but the bad guys die at the end of it, but like, to what end? Like, people have suffered, and it's not really a feel good comeuppance. It took me like a few months later, so I had to go from being 13 to turning 14 and rewatching it to actually finding it funny. Nymphoid Barbarian and Dinosaur Hell was like the first sudden shift in pacing for me, because at least like Bloodsucking Freaks still had that kind of kinetic energy to it.
Yeah.
And like once you get past the tacked on opening that Troma added to Nymphoid Barbarian and Dinosaur Hell, that's the film, the parking brake goes on. Like it's an abrupt shift. And then then there's just some that I've meant to revisit that just did not connect with me when I was that age. Like I don't want to put it down because this could have just been that it wasn't made for a 13-year-old, like any of these are. But I remember like renting Stuff Stephanie in the Incinerator and Scream Baby Scream, and just did not land with me. But for every one that didn't land, like even when I would just like start just buying them for ones I couldn't find, like Escape from Hell, I really couldn't get into, but I've kind of grown to realize, I just don't connect with women in prison films. So, but there's so many other ones that I just completely adored and loved. And I'd say there's very few Troma films I can outright say I regret watching that.
Same here. You've mentioned buying a bunch of Troma movies, and you've given me a glimpse into your collection. You have a pretty rad collection. I'd like you to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah. At one point, I believe I probably had the largest Troma collection in North America. 2002 was when I started taking my collection to eBay, when I just kind of like exhausted all the local video stores and waiting for, because it was like at the rise of DVD, a lot of places were getting rid of their entire VHS collection. And so oddly enough, comic book stores somehow started acquiring all the VHS tapes. So that's how I found Ocean Drive Weekend I got found Screenplay via those means, and Rock and Road Trip. That's what I was thinking of. So, but at some point, like with eBay, I realized, that guide that Lloyd has in the back of that book, I can just take to it. Because initially what got me, the first eBay purchase I ever made, is probably the crown jewel of my collection, is a 45 radio vinyl that I haven't seen another copy of before or since, for the movie Waitress, that has 2 radio commercials for Waitress on it. The funniest dish you've ever tasted. And I remember getting Lloyd to sign it later that summer when I went to Comic-Con in San Diego, and Lloyd choosing rarely not to personalize something, which is cool. Like he knew better than I did. So he signed it, Lloyd Kaufman, aka Samuel Wills. Um, and it's just, and to this day, like that's framed like in my room. And so from there, I realized, oh, I can like actually just search on eBay. So I would just in a regularly would search Troma, and then for the like, that's how I found Rebel Love, and it's how I actually wound up connecting with a lot of the Troma filmmakers who I'd reach out to, just being a huge Troma obsessive and ask them about their dealings with the studio and getting autographs. Like I met the filmmaker who did Rebel Love, or emailed. I emailed the filmmaker who did Rebel Love. He was really cool. One of the actors from They Called Me Macho Woman, who was really cool. And then later, so through another series of connections online, Jim Larson and Rob Hayward from Butt Crack were really cool. And yeah, Jim Larson also sent me a copy of Nigel the Psychopath, his first movie pre-Butt Crack, which is
awesome.
Yeah. And so then having eBay and realizing, oh, I can just search for, and because initially it was for ones that I couldn't find anywhere, like Adventure of the Action Hunters. Like that was a big eBay find for me. And then it wound up being ones where, as my local video stores closed, the ones that would only like carry one, the ones that had the only copy of Troma films I knew. And I was like, someday I might want to see this. I don't have access to that anymore. So I'd get like the Canadian Ballet off that, like the late, like the 99, 2000, 2001 VHS releases. And so it was cool to find and see all these different copies and different ones available, and building on that. And then eventually it spilled over into getting the original line of the Toxic Crusaders figures. And then just like when I just about annually visit flying from Minneapolis to New York to visit the Troma studios. And they always like Doug Sackman or someone else there would give me something cool. Like I have one of the Troma's Edge TV signs that they used on the show that has
that's so awesome.
Coffee still spilt on it. Thanks. Yeah. So I'm proud to have that. And also just going to the different conventions before, like the conventions were before like San Diego Comic-Con was such a huge mega multimedia event. Just being able to go, and whenever someone be promoting a project, like getting them to sign it, like and like Road to Perdition was like being really heavily. And I walked up to the director and like, hey, I really like this real-time movie you did for Troma. And so he signed it. And then like Brink Stevens signed it too. And they were really cool about it.
I got Brink Stevens to sign my copy of Mommy, which Max Allen Collins did as well.
Nice. Yeah, she's cool. She also signed my my poster of Fred Olen Ray's Haunting Fear.
Nice.
Yeah. Love Brink Stevens. Yeah, it's cool, like how cool so many of these people are. The Troma umbrella that connects and unites us all. So just slowly started growing a lot of that connection. And my other, I'm not going to say my other crown jewel, but I'll say, because that's a complete misuse of the term crown jewel.
Yeah.
let's say my scepter, I guess, if we're going to continue the royal metaphor.
Yeah.
I have one of the VHS screener copies of Terra Firma, because for those who don't know, Troma would bootleg their own movies before they would do the official VHS and later DVD releases. So they would sell copies of the screeners that they would be sending to theaters to fans. And I remember it was $50 for a VHS tape. And so in my young brain, I was like, well, if it's $50, I gotta make it worth it, because it was a VHS in a white sleeve. And the movie on it was the exact movie that we know and love, except at the bottom of the screen, it says for bootlegging purposes only throughout the entire thing. So over the years, I got it signed by Lloyd Kaufman, Joe Flyshaker, Reverend Jen, Will Keenan, the band Flip.
Nice.
And they're Minneapolis boys. I love Flip so much. Especially shouts out to Bryn. He's such a cool dude. And I think if there's like another one, if it's gonna come to me, that I might be missing. But yeah, so it's cool just the fact that they have this white sleeve that's like has all these signatures on it, and especially really like having the in a way it's like a Troma yearbook, I guess. And then having the Joe Flyshaker thing on there, and then I have a Tromeo and Juliet soundtrack CD that's signed by Lloyd Kaufman, Will Keenan, Joe Flyshaker, and James Gunn, which is cool. And just building those pieces on it. And yeah, it's cool having the collection and knowing, especially now, because there's some that I have that I look online that I, for ones that just, especially that late era of the ones that came out on VHS that just never made it to DVD. And I wonder if they just didn't get that much of a distribution. Because I remember it'd be ones that I would get from visiting the Troma building, like 50th Street Films put out one called Together and Alone, and there's some other ones too that I just didn't seem to come visibly seen when I searched them on Google, and like there's very little evidence of I was a teenage TV terrorist anywhere. So it's cool to like you said, like to have like these libraries or these catalogs to be a Tromaville historian. So.
You have, and for like the diehard fans out there, you have a really cool bootleg tape that you were telling me a story about of Big Gus, What's the Fuss?
Yes. So 2003 AD, Troma held a festival in Minneapolis, week long, at the St. Anthony Main Theater. Bill Carter, who recently passed on, put it on, and it was a blast. So for the first week, because I was planning on, going every single day. And this happened to tie in with the first week of school starting. And the high school I went to was walking distance from it. And so the Friday, it was the first day of the inaugural day of the festival, was also the first day of school. So I got my parents to write me a note to leave school early to go to a film festival, which I don't know in the history of the American educational system has been attempted, let alone been completely approved by the arts, and you're playing an important part in it. So my buddy Steve DeSalvo, who had graduated 2 years prior, but he went to the U of M, and they didn't start school for another week. We decorated his car all in Troma stuff. Like we covered it in the 8.5 by 11s, and we cut out Troma and colored construction paper and put it around it, and then had the big parade with Kabuki Man and Lloyd. We drove from the Dinkytown McDonald's, also rest in peace, to St. Anthony, Maine. The Nick Adams played, and it was such a great time. And so I was volunteering a lot of hours for Troma doing this, but it's like my passion. Like I loved it. And this almost felt like the fact that I got super into Troma just prior to going into high school, and now like my senior year is kicking off with this citywide celebration of Troma. Someone from Troma had reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you want any movies or anything for compensation for this?" And given that I like volunteered for Troma the previous 2 years at San Diego Comic-Con, I at that point had acquired every single movie that they had released that was at that point in print. And so I said, well, the only 2 movies that you're offering on the website that I don't have a copy of are The Girl Who Returned and Big Gus, What's the Fuss? And not thinking anything was going to come from it. So once the parade ends, Lloyd goes into the bathroom for a bit, and we're hanging out talking. He comes out of the bathroom, walks up to me, and he has this VHS tape, and he says, "Hey Chaz, just in the bathroom, man, we found just this smelly turd," and he handed it to me, and it was, lo and behold, a tape of Big Gus, What's the Fuss, signed by Lloyd Kaufman. He wrote on it, "To Chaz, this movie smells worse than your diarrhea." And on the front of it, he drew a really large Lloyd Kaufman signature and a little picture of Kabuki Man. And it's really cool to have that. And I recently tried rewatching it, and I remember I watched it slowly right after I got it, and I was expecting something just really, really dire, and I was like, oh, there's some good comedic moments in it, being a zealous 17-year-old. And then I'd recently converted to DVD and watched it, and it's not good. It is not good.
It's also funny, in the history of filmmaking, that's the movie that he also made for Canon, the Golden Globus Canon. Mm-hmm. So that it just makes me laugh. It's he didn't do Death Wish, he did Big Gus, What's the Fuss?
Yeah.
Well, I kind of want to shift it up a little bit. You're also one of my favorite rappers out there. Like I said, I heard some of your songs when you were posting them on the Troma message boards, and I had a good time. And then when you put out your album, Personal Reference, I downloaded that, and when I heard you sample The Critic right on the first song, I knew it was for me. So how'd you get into hip hop? Because you are also a scholar in in hip hop. You know the history very well, which is something, I always like following you and learning new things.
Thanks. Yeah, hip hop, I remember, being at that age where hip hop, while it was still a counterculture, began permeating into children's shows and commercials to where it was just always around. Like, I don't have a memory of a time before hip hop, even if it was just, a rapping frog on the bumpers for the Disney Afternoon, or Barney Rubble rapping for Fruity Pebbles, or the VHS tape having the "You're as funny as Fozzie Bear" rap that the Muppets put out. And so I remember randomly channel surfing once and coming across MTV and seeing the Busta Rhymes "Woo Ha Got You All in Check" video, and being a kid who was really into superheroes and wrestling and these larger than life characters, and realizing, oh, like rappers kind of were like that. They were these personalities that were, with the volume cranked way up, and they had these essentially these stories, these narratives they were painting, and these adventures you could follow that were also incredibly catchy, and just the fantastic linguistic achievements. And it's that kind of just became just like how, like with Troma, I tried to see, every Troma thing I could see. With hip hop, it began being, I gotta acquire as many things as I can and gotta listen to everything. And so, I'd go to the local store cheapo and, find the used CD that I want and listen to it and read the liner notes and see who they shouted out, then go back the next week and see if anyone they shouted out had put out an album and hear that. And it was just cool seeing like that family tree of hip hop, and especially in America, and being at an age where the other genres are great. And I love a lot of genres, but to a certain degree at that point, there's a certain, for lack of a better term, like homogenization in terms of like the one pipeline that everyone hears the same bands, everyone has the same influences, no matter where you are in the country, for the most part. Whereas with hip hop, so much of it is still neighborhood based, so much of it is still regional based. I mean, obviously, East Coast artists don't sound like West Coast artists, but even on like a smaller level of that, Memphis artists don't sound like Houston artists. North Dakota artists don't sound like South Dakota artists. There's so many nuances and differences, and just these like separate family trees to just follow the connection of. And that's what I always find incredibly appealing to me. And well, I've always maintained an interest in the genre because there really isn't a lot of time to get bored. And while there definitely have been fads that haven't been for me, for any time, like, I'm not super into like whatever, like a trend in a sound or style or mixing or vocals is, it usually like 1 year later will have inspired someone else making something completely different that still has its roots in that style that I'm suddenly super drawn to. So that's just how it's always maintained in my interests.
And one thing, and maybe this is also inspired by Troma a little bit, but I appreciated when you were on the airwaves and you would give independent rap artists their chance to get their play on the radio. I always thought that was really cool of you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's being at Go 95.3 here in Minneapolis, where I hosted a show called First Impressions. Was Sunday nights from 10 to midnight on Go 95.3, bringing the best of hip hop's indie ground, underground, local, international bootlegs and deep cuts, all in 1 2-hour span. And I kind of had an open door policy where any artist, whether it be like especially super local ones or nationwide, if people would wind up getting interested in the show, would send things in. And being having lived in New York for 11 years, living in LA for a year, and just having these different relationships with different scenes and covering different artists for the places I'd written for, there's so much great music out there. And being in a city like Minneapolis that if they like something, will support something. And within about 2 years, like 26 months on the air, this 10 p.m. Sunday night show hit #1 in the ratings, but who's counting? And I think a big part of that is because Minneapolis supports things that they find that they like. And it was really cool playing a lot of artists for the first time. So for some, I was a lot of artists like first radio exposure ever. And then for some other ones who like been maybe getting momentum in different parts of the country, being able to play them out here and be the first to play them out here. And then when they would finally like play here for the first time in like 3-4 months, when they were getting no other support from other outlets, seeing like, that venue packed for them. And I didn't make the songs, and so I'm not taking credit for it, but there's just something I like that I am helping point people in the direction of something that I think is really cool. And then that perhaps inspires a local artist around here to take that influence, make something really cool out here. And it helps put money in the pocket and have a good experience out here for whatever artist is touring here. And it's something that I can't believe more people aren't embracing, especially in a medium like radio, when, if you have something to run with it. And I know it's because a lot of radio stations, their playlists are determined by someone not even in the state they're usually broadcasting in. But even like on these other levels, like, there's so much talent out there. It's never been easier to make music, record a high quality product, and to distribute it and to get it out and get it around. And as we've seen, with streaming, people still love music. People still voraciously take as much music as they can, and they love music that they really love. And, while unfortunately Go came to an end last December due to the owners wanting to exit the radio business, even though we were still very successful, I wish, even if I wasn't at the helm of it, something like my show still existed. But I'm sure something like that will hopefully come around again. Like there's still, but whether my show's on or not, like hip hop continues, and there's still so many amazing artists out here, and so many amazing artists, all over the world, just, making their art. And it's a beautiful thing.
You have a new album out now, Small Hours, and it's fun. It's different, I feel, than some of your other albums. It feels a little more personal. But it also, I feel like it helps capture just a lot of the emotion of, the last few years on there in all these tracks. You want to talk a little bit more about your album?
Thanks. Yeah. It definitely, I tried to capture a lot of the feelings of that I think comes with isolation. I didn't want to make an album about the novel coronavirus and the pandemic that ensued as a result of it, because I kind of fear that a lot of art being made directly and specifically about that is going to age like a fine milk. And if you look at like the last like major pandemic we had, like the Spanish flu, and I know like, there's a 70s pandemic, which weren't quite as bad as these things, but let's just, as a point, the Spanish flu, there was very little art created in the aftermath of that. And I think part of that is when you think, why is no one chronicling or talking about this absolutely major historic event that affected everyone? And I think it could just be people were just so happy to be over with it. They didn't want to remember the worst years of their lives in any sort of capacity. So instead, I turned the living at home thing internally on myself, because I use my stimmy check to buy a microphone and a pop filter, same one I'm talking to you with on right now, and really learn through YouTube, like mixing things and sound. And I've had a rough go of it, because in addition to, I'm single, I live alone in an apartment, like I don't have pets, which in general I like. But, for a pandemic, it can get pretty particularly lonely, especially when you're used to going out to shows that they're not happening anymore. And I had a fire and flood when the sprinkling system malfunctioned in late 2020, September 2020, and fashionably late 2020. And during that time when I was like impromptu having to like move apartments by myself, I came across a collection of beats that were created by the producer Blockhead, who's most known for working with Aesop Rock. In fact, he and Aesop Rock just dropped a new album this month that's very good, called Garbology. And Blockhead also put out a new solo instrumental album called Space Werewolves Will Be the End of Us All, which if you're listening to this podcast, you probably love that title. And you're completely right, because it's a great title. I highly recommend giving them both a listen. And anyway, so I found this because he and I have known each other since about 2008, 2009, and we used to post on the same message board. And he had posted a selection of beats he had created from 2000 to 2003 that he had just never used on projects, just to like kind of like share it. And I remember really liking them, and I saved them to a CDR. And then while moving, I came across it again and I put it on. I'm like, wow, this stuff is actually really good. And, and outside of people, I guess, who, were on that Phila Flava message board, over a decade ago, or maybe who've like come across like the some of them have been like collections he put on his blog. No one had really heard a lot of these, and no one had for sure rapped over them yet. So I reached out to him, got his permission to use them. and made an album. And I try to just kind of just focus on, small hours themselves are those hours like, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. and those conversations you have with yourself when you're alone with yourself really late at night and dealing with, whether it's, and now it's like magnified during the pandemic, but just, the feelings of, trauma, of OCD, which I have, of, the separation anxiety, of just the loneliness, losing touch with people, and panic attacks, and another delightful subjects. In the middle of it, there's a really good shrimp cocktail recipe. And so the focus, like with a lot of that album, was, it's experimental as it is, because like these beats that he made were part of what was initially a beat tape. So they weren't cut in the standard, 16 bar verse, 8 bar hook, 16 bar verse, 8 bar hook way that a lot of rap things were. And so I decided to use that unpredictable aesthetic, that different aesthetic, to try to like mimic what it's like having an OCD attack, or what it's like having a panic attack, or what it's like when you're really beating yourself up over something, or like dealing with trauma. Because a lot of those things, there is that level of uncertainty. And I think it delivered. It's very different. Like when I say it's an experimental record, like I want to say it's a rap record, and I promise you I'm rhyming, and I promise you I'm on beat. Like it's not one of those, hyper, rapping, but sound. It's like I'm not just like a slam poet with the beat under me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm really proud of it. Like it's definitely, I think, like you mentioned, it's different from anything else I've done, just in terms of like, it's, it's a different time. And like, I'll generally, like in next things, I'm going to be probably doing things that are closer to what I've done prior to this. But I figured, this is going to be my, my vulnerable, bare bones trauma OCD coping with what's going on right now release. So, but yeah, I'm glad you like it.
It's really good. And like you said, like the song Panic, like it you capture what it feels like to have a panic attack. When you're listening to that, you're like, yep, I understand it. Or even like ghost work, when applying for a job and not hearing back from somebody, not texting you, but like the dread you feel from that. Like you capture those feelings very well on the album.
Yeah, and I think like in particular with the album, like with it being small hours, there's something about, whether it's insomnia or just like waking up at a weird time, and like when you're replaying the day's events over and over in your head, and like in the things like that happen, and it hurts and hits so much worse in those hours. So thank you. I'm glad you dig it.
And yeah, at the end of the show, I'm gonna play Coming Attractions, Oh Yeah, on there for everybody to check out. One last thing though, on the hip hop thing. So my next episode, I'm gonna have another rapper on, Extra Cool. But I had a dream that you and Extra Cool did a song together about Troma movies, and so I tweeted both of you guys, and you made my dream come true. And so that song will play on the next episode. But
I'm glad that we're putting a teaser for it in the next one. So yeah. And yeah, that was really, I really had a fun time working with that. The beat was really cool. Extra Cool is a cool dude. His latest release is very good as well. And it's nice when you can like go deep on themes and something that someone is equally sharing the passion for. And my love of Troma and my connection to Troma, and in anything I'd ever worked on, whether it was when I was writing for the New York Times, the Village Voice, and LA Weekly, and Complex, or whether it was the on-air radio things or in hip hop, like there's certain things when you have such a passion for it, you almost feel, and this is all entirely in my head because I have OCD, but you feel like you almost have like a certain responsibility in doing it justice when presenting it to an audience. And, as much as I've always wanted to do a song about Troma, I didn't want to do somewhere with just like, yeah, Toxic Avenger. Yeah, he crushed a head. Yeah, Toxic Avenger. The blood is red. Like there's someone's like, yeah, like, this is a movie that exists, and I have seen this movie.
Troma,
and
aroma, how great it is.
Well, that's like that. For first time, the initial Troma rap is great, and for a freestyle, for someone who's not a rapper, Julie Strain's Troma rap is a special place in my heart too. Yeah, A funny story about that, like when I saw Troma at the 2000 Comic Con, and at that point, I think the Troma rap had only been on the VHS tape of Sergio Lapel's Drawing Blood. And so Julie Strain had asked the crowd, and she was on the Troma dais with the Rock Me Troma dais with James Gunn and Lloyd and Chad Farron of Unspeakable fame. She said, "So has anyone here seen the Troma rap?" And I clapped, and she said, "Oh, the young man in the front row has seen it." So it was cool to have Julie Strain call me a young man. Rest in peace, Julie.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. That same, just so I can just get more Troma anecdotes spilling out here. That same Comic-Con, when I met Chad Farron, he gave me a poster of Unspeakable and signed it, "To Chaz, don't let the world shit on you, Chad Farron." So
that's awesome. Yeah. His movie Unspeakable, that's one I want to do on a future episode. That movie is rough, but it's really good.
Yeah. I remember that was one because Troma had the foresight. I almost did a total Lloyd joke there where I said the foresight and the foreskin to not put region blocking or recording blocking on their DVDs. So because I believe, I think I may have mentioned I have OCD. I didn't like borrowing my DVDs as a kid just because I didn't feel like even my friends who I love held the same reverence for this very delicate disc that I did. So I would just record VHS tapes of the Troma movies, and then like I'd pass those around and borrow them to them. And Unspeakable's one that, yeah, it's stylistically it's very cool, and so I wouldn't say that like the people I showed it to disliked it by any stretch. Like they enjoyed the experience, but it's also kind of the people I knew who could be pushed to like their absolute limits. Like that's the thing that pushed them to like their absolute limits. Yeah, there's some brutal stuff in that. Like Unspeakable is probably the combat shock of its era, and this is the only podcast that I can say that on, and everyone will immediately know what I'm referring to.
Okay. I think we should dive into the 1990 film directed by James Bond III, Death by Temptation.
His destiny had been foretold. Its fate had been forewarned. He did not know that something so sweet could be so evil. Now, the fate of mankind hangs in the balance as Kadeem Hardison, TV's Dwayne Wayne.
This honey I met the other night was bad. Bad. Super bad.
And Bill Nunn from Do the Right Thing get busy in the first contemporary horror thriller of its kind. James Bond III's Death by Temptation. She's every man's dream and your worst nightmare.
She leaves with men, and you never see them again. Look, now, when she drinks that holy water, she's gonna start slobbering and farting and gagging.
I'm on a mission and nobody can cramp my style. So if you can't get down, stay at the crib for a while. I don't mean to be cruel and know my heart.
Death by Temptation, a new movie from Troma. With new music by Ashford and Simpson, Melba Moore, Najee, and Freddie Jackson.
This is what Lloyd Kaufman says about Death by Temptation in his book, All I Need to Know About Filmmaking I Learned from the Toxic Avenger. Samuel L. Jackson, Pulp Fiction, Jurassic Park. Kadeem Hardison, A Different World. Bill Nunn, Do the Right Thing, Sister Act, and Melba Moore star in this critically acclaimed studio-quality showcase of young black talent. A succubus with a trail of dead men behind her goes head to head with a young divinity student who is questioning his faith. The Los Angeles Times called this a potent horror fantasy, and the Hollywood Reporter said it was fascinating, intelligent entertainment, better than anything Spike Lee's ever done.
Ooh. I'm like, that's so cool. Going from the very start of it, when you have the Troma red skyline pop up, but you hear that excellent score instead of the normal Troma excellent score that you normally hear the Troma logo leader.
Yeah.
So from the beginning, you know something is different about this, and it's so stylish and cool. And I'm assuming you watched the Vinegar Syndrome release of this before us recording this.
I did, and it's
Cool.
it looks so good. It's a really good Blu-ray.
Especially seeing, I mean, especially in the fact that, because everything in this whole movie looks great, but in terms of things that the Troma logo has never looked better than it does on very specifically this Blu-ray release.
Yes. I've seen the old DVD, which is from a tape master, but just like how crystal clear this movie is, which on some movies, you know, especially with the Vinegar Syndrome releases, it helps you see the edges more, but not on Death by Temptation. It's just like, oh, this is a very well made movie.
Yeah, I'm just gonna write out and say it. This might be the best movie in the entire Troma library.
And Lloyd, actually, I have an audio clip of Lloyd saying that.
In my opinion, Death by Temptation just may be the very best movie in Troma's 200 film collection. It's certainly the best that we have had, in my opinion, that we've had the honor to be involved in bringing to the silver screen.
But yeah, like genuinely, like legitimately, and it's better with age. Like it's better than it's ever been. Like now, it's so good. It's really, really good.
And the pedigree of filmmaking that was on this movie is ridiculous. So we have the director James Bond III, who he is an actor, but he, you know, started as a child actor and went to Spike Lee, and he was in School Days, and that's where he met Ernest Dickerson, who's the director of photography. He knew Kadeem Hardison before, but they were also in School Days, and Bill Nunn and Sam Jackson, they were also all in School Days. And Samuel, like when you hear people promoting like Troma, Samuel L. Jackson got his start in Troma, which, you know, isn't accurate, but he is in a Troma movie.
Yeah. But what an auspicious start it is to say Death by Temptation, because he is excellent in this movie.
He's really good. When I was at Troma Dance a while ago, but I was dressed up as the Toxic Avenger doing the Troma parades down Main Street, and I saw Samuel Jackson up on a balcony. He was there promoting Black Snake Moan, and I yelled out, I was like, "Death by Temptation!" And he looked down, he definitely acknowledged, and he laughed. And I'm sure he's like, that's a movie I was in a long time ago with those guys, but it's like, ha.
Yeah, I know, like there was an interview with him a few years ago where someone asked him about Death by Temptation, and he smiled, and, you know, he said he's happy that Troma has it and was happy to hear they were still in business too. So yeah, I actually when we were watching this, I tweeted at Kadeem Hardison about how he still comes off as the coolest watching it, and he liked my tweet. So that's my riveting add to that.
And I would definitely recommend, if you're gonna pick up a physical copy of it, that Vinegar Syndrome, it looks great. There's a fun interview with Ernest Dickerson that I'm gonna play clips throughout the episode with, but it's a really just fascinating interview with him and Lloyd on there, and I mean, it just looks really good. And there's even there's an interview with James Bond III, which was taken over the telephone. So it's like kind of a rough listen, but the stuff he says is interesting. It's just I can't play any clips from it on the show because the audio quality is pretty rough on that, but it is something worth listening to.
Yeah. And I will say, in lieu of, if you can find that, because I know Vinegar Syndrome does like the limited number of the releases, there's a chance that as you're hearing this, maybe at a time when they're sold out of it. As a backup, the number 2 you should get was the original 1998 Troma DVD release of it. And in a very distant third, if you're doing a disc of it, the Troma retro release of it that came out in 2009. And the reason I say that is because someone at Troma made a mistake, believe it or not. And for the feature, they used the master of the edited for television standards and broadcasting version. So it cuts out a significant amount of the violence and the fun, wholesome cussing that makes the movie so special.
I don't own that one, so I'm going to have to go and track that version down for my collection just to have the edited version as well.
I was about to say no, you don't have to, but then I remembered I'm someone who deliberately went out of his way to get the R-rated version of Troma's War. So that would be entirely hypocritical for me to dissuade you from your completionist efforts.
Yes. Thank you. You get it.
I'm also going to save any potential Troma fans here who are trying to do the same thing sometime. The edited for television standards VHS release of Romeo and Juliet does not exist. It appears in the trailer for it on the home video versions. Like they mention it like in the trailer, but there's no evidence to suggest that was ever mass produced for commercial consumption.
And then I will say that the R-rated version of Terra Firma is not on the DVD.
Yeah.
But it is on VHS. So you can always get that.
Yeah,
but,
your best bet for that is like look for a Terra Firma VHS. It looks like it was at one point in a Hollywood video, because then you know for sure it's the R-rated version.
That's where mine came from. It is funny. They they went out and filmed little skits and stuff for all the gore and nudity that got cut out. But back to Death by Temptation. So I guess the original title of the movie was Temptation, and James Bond III said that when they were working on the soundtrack, they wrote Death by Temptation on the label, and he saw that and was like, oh, that's actually a better title than just Temptation. So he went with that, but the movie was shot under the title Temptation. And then they filmed part of this movie in Lawrence Fishburne's house.
Mm-hmm. And I saw that, and I'd always seen for years in the credits that it would say, the Fishburne or house provided by like the Fishburnes estate of the Fishburnes. And I always thought it would be just kind of joking, like, oh yeah, it's got to be Lawrence Fishburne's house, and it turns out it actually was. It's
kind of a bummer. Like it would have been fun just to see like Lawrence Fishburne like in one of the bar scenes, like in the background or something. But it's pretty cool that they let him use his house. And it seemed like this filmmaking crew, with Ernest Dickinson, the cast, was all very incestuous with all the Spike Lee films that were also happening in New York at the same time. Like it all seemed like they all worked on each other's projects, which is pretty cool.
And funny connection to it. So both Spike Lee and Ernest Dickerson and myself are all NY unicorns. And my first year at NYU, my freshman year was 0405, so predating YouTube. And so the Bopes Library, the famous NYU library, and the Troma in me is going to point out, this is the year that NYU had their single largest student suicide rate. But the Bopes Library has everyone's student films they'd ever made. So you can go in there and just watch like Spike Lee student films. And one of those is a rejected video that he made, shot with Ernest Dickerson for Sugar Hill Records for Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's White Lines that starred Lara Fishburne.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's pretty rad. Yeah, we have this Grandmaster Flash video starring Lawrence Fishburne, shot by Ernest Dickerson, directed by Spike Lee. Not good enough.
Yeah, we're gonna have to pass on that. We're only tackling projects like at the Ice Arcade at this moment from Sugar Hill. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
That's pretty funny. When this movie came out in Sweden, they were promoting it as the sequel to Vampire in Brooklyn, which is kind of funny.
That's an important thing to point out too. Yeah, because this hit after the Shapiro Glickenhaus thing, Troma didn't officially release it on Troma Team Video until 1997. And so I think part of that is riding the wave that Vampire in Brooklyn had in 1996, 1 year prior.
And it's funny too, because Kadeem Hardison is also in Vampire in Brooklyn. So I could see how that would happen.
Yeah.
And then according to two different interviews I've heard, it was either shot in Bed-Stuy or Fort Greene in Brooklyn. So that's go wander around and try to find the locations and send me pictures of the houses and bars.
I'm like 90% sure it's Fort Greene.
Yeah. I was like, wait a minute. Yeah, I think it was James Bond said Bed-Stuy and Ernest Dickerson said Fort Greene, and I'm a little more inclined to believe Ernest Dickerson.
Yeah, I mean, I could be wrong. Like, that's why I put that 10% margin of error in there, but very much more Fort Greene. Of course, this was 14 years before I moved to New York, and who knows how it's changed now. But yeah, that looks a lot more like Fort Greene than Bed-Stuy.
And we should mention, Ernest Dickerson, he was a DP, but this was like right kind of as his career was kicking off. But I have an audio clip I'm going to play of Ernest talking about how he got hooked up with James Bond III for this movie and why he did it.
I met James Bond III, who is the writer-director of it. I met him when we were doing School Days for Spike Lee. James Bond was one of the actors. And, we're always talking, after a day of shooting, you're always going into the bar and sitting down at the bar and talking. And he just kind of mentioned that he had this film that he wanted to do. It was a horror film. He didn't have a script. He had a general idea of what the movie was going to be. And he wanted me to shoot it. And I said, yeah, fine, sure. Usually in conversations like that, you don't think it's actually going to happen. But think about a year later, James called me up and said that he had the money to do this, that he had made a deal with a record company. I think it was Hush. Hush Records, I think.
Yep.
That was owned by the husband of Melba Moore. They were married at that time. And he had a script, and I came on board, and that's how it happened. That's how it started. Well, I did Death by Temptation because I love horror films. I love good horror films. I was looking for something in the fantastic genre to do, and this story came along. James didn't have there was a lot of things he had no idea of what he wanted to do with the story. So, and the visuals. So he basically agreed that he would handle the actors and I would handle everything else.
It can't be stressed enough how vitally important Ernest Dickerson is to this movie. So much of the vibe, just the look of it, so much of it just pulls you in. And I'm not saying that to downplay anyone else's work. Like, it's superbly written, it's superbly acted, but just, from the first time you watch Death by Temptation, there's so many images that are not going to leave your mind. And especially now looking at a Vinegar Syndrome Blu-ray release of it, and now those things are so much heightened. So everything that you thought was great, seeing it, on BET late one night or getting a VHS tape in, extended play versus now and seeing it so vividly. It is so phenomenal.
They talk about how low budget it is, but it does not look it. Like, it looks very lush and like they had money to make this movie.
Yeah. I think it goes to, but there's only like 3 locations total in the whole thing. And I think it just shows, like, if you're making an independent film, put all your money into making like 3 things look really good, and then that'll be the bulk of it, and you'll have something that just looks amazing.
So one thing I like to do is I like to see what other Troma connections there are with the people who were in the cast and crew of this. So I have a list here. So Kadeem Hardison, who's the star, he is the narrator in BC Butcher that just came out from Troma. the costume designer, John Michael Reefer, he did costumes in Class of Nukem High, Kabuki Man. He did locations. The Jack Cooley, who did sound, he did sound for Cry Uncle, Love Thrill Murders, The Children, Zombie Island Massacre, and not Troma movies, but Troma important. He also did sound for Joe and Silent Night, Bloody Night. Lloyd worked on both of those films. And then there's a whole crew of people who worked on Kabuki Man, because it should be said in the Troma history of things. Kabuki Man was shot before Death by Temptation, so there was definite some crew stealing for pickup shots and stuff, which we'll get into a little bit later. Another sound artist, Charles Hunt, did sound for Beware Children at Play. The first camera AC, Jonathan Burkhart, he is a camera op for Troma's War. One of the gaffers, Tony Estern, was a gaffer on Blades. Stefan Harshman, who's the editor, he was in the Toxic Avenger 2 art department. And the music editor, he did sound for Toxie 2, and he scored Fortress of America. So some pretty all over the place Troma connections is kind of neat.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the strength of what the East Coast indie world looked like at that point.
Yeah, it's like the perfect time, like when we get into our double features, like you could see the people who were paying their dues then were doing it more with the Corman school of things, but the people who were paying their dues from Death by Temptation definitely got their start at Troma, so which is pretty neat. Let's dig into the plot of Death by Temptation. What would you call like the main woman in the movie? It's promoted as a vampire movie sometimes it's a demon or succubus promoted movie. What was your take?
I call it a succubus.
Okay.
I think it's easier to sell a movie as a vampire movie than a succubus movie, just because vampires are more known than succubi. And I wonder how much of it comes from that one famous production still of the succubus character with the fangs at the top and bottom of her mouth.
Yeah.
And people just run with. And I think because so much of the movie deals with spirituality, vampires are the most commonly associated horror villain with spirituality. So it's an easy sort of connection to make to say vampire. So, yeah.
So, and we have, and she doesn't have a name. They call her later on in the film. They call her Temptation, but she doesn't really have a name. But you could recognize her in every scene because she has these long gold fingernails and just looking very glamorous whenever she's hanging out in this dive bar where a good chunk of the movie takes place. And the cast of characters at the dive bar is pretty fun. You see Bill Nunn, who was in like Do the Right Thing. He plays a character named Dougie, and he's just at the bar, flirting and hitting on women and missing every single time.
The first time I saw Spider-Man in theaters and saw Bill Nunn in it, I saw him and I went, Dougie!
That's awesome. And you have the Kadeem Hardison, who plays Kay, who he fucking steals this movie. Like when you see a Troma movie, you kind of have an idea generally of how the performances are going to be in there, and you don't really expect like a class performance in a Troma film typically, and he is really good and really funny. Like he just seems like somebody you'd kind of want to hang out with.
Definitely. And just as the perfect contrast to James Bond III's main character, Joel, who's very square, very, religious, but heart's in the right place.
Yeah.
Coming to New York and having a well-meaning tour guide. Kadeem is so perfect in this.
And I guess James Bond III, who plays Joel, he wrote that part for himself. He didn't have anybody else in mind for that. So I wonder, just listening to some of his interview on the Vinegar Syndrome thing, like how autobiographical that character is to his feelings. Anyways, it's kind of interesting to think about, because he seems like a very spiritual, religious person, especially when watching this movie.
The party was born to play himself.
Right. This movie has some pretty fun lines. So like right at the beginning, we see this bartender, talking about trying to go get abortions and then cheating on somebody, having somebody cheat on their spouse. And then he picks up the succubus woman and he brings her home. He's like, "You hot-natured freakazoid who can't wait to jump my bones, because I got the key to your old pleasures." And it's like, oh man.
My favorite part of that quote is the first part of that, where he says, "I can tell a lot about a woman by their bed, and this freaky bed belongs to a hot-natured freakazoid."
and it's like got like lace and candles all over the place, and she has her mirror covered, so that should be the first clue that something's up.
Mm-hmm.
And she lures him into the shower with a belt around his neck, and they're in the throes of making whoopee in the shower, and blood just starts pouring out of the spigot in there.
Another reason I think it's Fort Greene.
Right. Pretty typical for the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then he runs around the house naked, flopping all over the place, and you hear screams and growls, and blood pours out from under the door. And we are then introduced to the preacher, Sam Jackson. And I was just thinking, like, watching Sam Jackson's performance, how funny it would be if he did his infamous Pulp Fiction line in this movie as well, because I could see Quentin Tarantino having lifted something from this.
It goes without saying, Quentin Tarantino's definitely seen this motion picture.
Yeah, Sam Jackson is given a impassioned sermon, and you see a spooky black lady wearing it's like a funeral garb, basically, with a black veil over her face, and thunder and lightning. You could tell that she's up to no good, because all this thunder and lightning's in the church, and it cuts to Sam Jackson and his wife and child driving off, and he goes to hit her, but it doesn't work out. He ends up crashing, and he gets covered in blood, and his son survives, who's to be raised by his grandma. This is Joel, our hero, and he's growing up to be a minister, but needs a break to go hang out with his cousin Kay in New York.
It's and it only gets better from there, folks. I'm guessing if you're listening to this podcast right now, you've seen this, but if you haven't, absolutely see Death by Temptation. Yes. It is such a phenomenal film. It is so good.
So I had a question for you. So I know, listening to James Bond's thing, how his interview, how she represents temptation, but I got another read from her character in the film. So the succubus, she only kills people that she has had sex with, and one of the people that she kills in the film, he gets all sorts of cuts and bruises and sores on him, and then she says that she gave him something that will grow and grow until it consumes him. And thinking about the time when this movie was made, it made me wonder if she was supposed to be a representation of like the AIDS pandemic that was rampant, especially in the African American community at that time.
I think that scene is that's definitely a nod to AIDS in the Black community, but I think in the grander scope of things, the writing of the temptation character seems to be a metaphor for spirituality, the more judgmental side of spirituality, especially within the Black community. because if you look at who she brutally murders, the first one she murders is, she murders someone who is, stepping out on their wife. She's murdering someone who is, openly advocating. We've heard moments ago for someone to get an abortion. She murders someone who earlier we've seen in the film is a homosexual. These are all things that the more exclusatory part of Black spirituality and spirituality in general, any sort of religious circles that get into that sort of exclusatory bent make as the target for all the things wrong. And with so much of the film being good versus evil, while she is this evil succubi character, effectively her hit list is the same list of people who would be determined undesirable by someone who would normally be in a religious perspective of evangelical minister that our lead character is.
And she has a pretty rough time, trying to seduce him later on in the film. Like, she seduces Kay earlier before she meets Joel, and he has a sexy dream with super sexy saxophones, and she's feeding him grapes and bananas, which
is, let's just say, the sexiest instrument, the sexiest fruits. Like, this movie just oozes sensuality.
Yes.
Remember when people named those particular fruits and instruments the sexiest fruits and instruments of 1990? Like, it was just so on point.
It was the cover of People magazine, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, and the cover of Instruments magazine and Fruits magazine.
There's this scene that I loved in there because Joel is such a square, and Kay is just trying to get him to loosen up. So he's trying to convince him to go to the bar, and they have a wacky outfit changing montage, like the glamming up the ugly girl montage in this movie.
It's so good. And then at the very last part of it too, when he finally looks nice, and then you have him and Kay do the pound slap, and still it's just barely works in terms of the communication thing, and you can tell Joel is trying so hard. What I like about it compared to a lot of similar scenes in movies is you usually just get a montage where it's all just body language of saying no, 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 yes. Whereas with this, you have, that's why when I reached out, I was curious how much of the dialogue in that was improv, because Kadeem is very funny and very naturally cool. But also what I think stands out is him saying, in addition, when he's riffing on him, saying this almost works, this could work, maybe this, not that. And I think that just makes it a bit different than just a bad, bad, bad. Oh, finally something good that we normally see, diverting from that cliche.
And even the good one, he's like, it'll do.
Yeah. But one more thing about that scene too, what I think works about it is he's letting them all use clothes from his own closet. But the fact they're saying that he's an actor, so he would have all these clothes that he doesn't necessarily like that are from other eras. So it's just such a really thoughtful, logical way that it makes sense that why he would have clothes he himself doesn't like that looks even worse on this L7 weenie square church boy who would be drawn to these particular conservative clothes. It's just such a thoughtful movie where everything makes sense. So I thought that was a really cool, subtle, played way they did that.
Yeah, even towards the end of the movie, they set it up early on. He's like, yeah, I'm an actor. I keep some of the props from my movie, like this Uzi, and I keep the knives over here because you never know. I live in the hood. So Joel meets the succubus, and Kay gets a little upset because he was flirting with her earlier, but he wants Joel to get out and experience life. So he doesn't really say anything until he calls her on it. A little later, he goes up to Dougie, who's hanging out in the bar, and it turns out Dougie's not just there flirting with women. He basically runs the X-Files before the X-Files was a thing. Which that was when I first saw that, that was not a plot twist I was expecting.
But it's so good and it's so believable. And I think what also shows the strength of Kadeem Hardison as an actor and his character work is Kadeem Hardison's reaction to, man, I can't believe what I'm seeing. Is at that point, he's the avatar for the audience watching it. So the fact that he's in disbelief about it makes it easier for us to accept our own disbelief instead of it being a movie ruining plot twist.
Yeah. And so Dougie and Kay, they go and see a psychic, and she gives them the lowdown that she's a demon named Temptation, and the succubus, she possesses Madame Sonia and threatens everybody. So Dougie and Kay, they're like, we have to kill her. What do you think about their plan to take her out?
Well, you skipped over when they talked to the fortune teller and which is the cameo from probably at that point when the film's released, the biggest star of the movie, singer Melba Moore.
There's a few pretty big cameos from the time, like Freddie Jackson is in the film as well, which it's pretty impressive that they got some of these cameos back when I don't imagine it was as easy as like these days to get somebody to show up in your stuff.
I believe, if I recall correctly, because a lot of this movie was James Bond III got a substantial chunk of the money for the making of this from Orpheus Records, who also held or released the soundtrack. And I know it was Hush Management who a lot of the artists on the soundtrack were being managed by. And I want to say at the time, Melba Moore's husband was either
he ran Hush.
He ran Hush? Okay.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember if he ran Hush or Orpheus. It sounds. I'm deferring to you. You're probably right. He ran Hush, and so that might have been because it had one of her songs in the soundtrack that she would then just. I could see someone like that, appearing in that as a favor, added a little credit to it, and also with how a lot of like black movies on cable would be distributed at that point, having her name in it would pretty much ensure it would wind up being played on BET. And why I continue to have like a life in like Stars in Black and other black premium cable channels for years to come.
Which is pretty funny to think about how the movie's marketed now, where Samuel L. Jackson is like big on the cover, but he maybe has 5 minutes at the most of screen time.
Well, what a 5 minutes, I mean, hey,
it's not like Kevin Costner in Sizzle Beach, USA.
Yeah, but I think it's more akin to Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs. Like that's only a 14-minute difference between their contributions to either film.
But they draw you in their scenes every single time.
No, definitely.
Kay and Dougie, they go to try to kill the succubus by slipping some holy water into her drink, which was pretty I don't know, like it was a jarring scene to watch in 2021 to see a bartender put something in a woman's drink.
On one hand, yes. On the other, it's technically a succubus.
That's true.
So, and as in like, if anyone's listening to this, we're not a metaphorical succubus. She's a literal succubus in the film. Like she's murderer, and some of those murders you could be of the thought where it's one of those. There's a subgenre of horror film that has a fandom that I completely support called good for her horror films, where women kill men who absolutely deserve it. Things like ranging from I Spit on Your Grave to Midsummer.
Yes.
And so I could conceive, religious overtones potentially aside, no, maybe even like as part of it, I could see Death by Temptation falling into that good for her genre. If you're judging the men she takes in as being, if you think if the death penalty is something warranting probably 2 of the 3 murders we see.
Yes.
And so, and plus it's like, putting holy water in it is like, it's, but yeah, he mentions it's freshly blessed holy water too, which I love the idea that it's not like, it's been sitting down for a few days. So, some of the blessing may have worn off, or the blessing didn't quite take to it. So we had to baptize your child twice because the first baptism just didn't take. So
we just find out that holy water is not shelf stable. really.
Right, yeah, just the quality level holy water. So
it's like EpiPen. Like it's starting to get a little funky.
Yeah, but when the holy water changes colors when you need to like refill, you're thinking holy water. And I wish there would have been a scene where he's like, he pulls up on like some priest, like, "Hey, Father, sorry to bother you. Can you just bless this for me really quick?" "Okay, my son. Why do you? It's best you don't know. Just bless this water for me, please. Thank you, FBI." So yeah, but yeah, no, I agree. Like, the fact that a bartender can be paid off to just put something in a woman's drink.
Like
the bartender doesn't know it's a succubus. So
yeah, he doesn't know the backstory of it. It's like, can you go put this in her drink? And then to quote Dougie, it's like, she'll be slobbering, farting, and gagging and shit.
Yeah, which is one of the clips they use in the trailer. And
yeah,
as much as I love that movie, that scene and the trailer is amazing too. I don't get why that particular clip was used in the trailer. Like, was that to show there's a lighthearted side to it too, maybe? But yeah,
I mean, I guess I could kind of see it because the movie is a lot funnier than you would expect it to be from the trailer.
That's true,
because the trailer is fairly serious, except for one or two bits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that actually. Now you mention it.
She drinks this, and then all the bottles start to explode in the bar, and then they go to try to stab her, but she's too powerful, and she says they're gonna fight the beasts. So they go out to go get them, and their car, Dougie and Kay's car, is missing. So Dougie, he's like, I'm a cop, and he hijacks a random car.
Another reason why I think it's Fort Creek.
Yes. And at the same time, Joel is getting seduced by the succubus. He's making out with her, and she's trying to pressure him into drinking some wine, but he sticks to his guns, and he does not drink it. So she stirs the wine with her finger, and then takes a sip and spits it into his mouth, and he passes out. And then we cut to probably one of the most iconic parts of the film, where Kay's looking for just weapons to kill the succubus, and he's at his house, and he enters a room, and he sees himself on the TV, and he gets eaten by the television, and
then regurgitated, the blood comes out, and we see the knife, and then we see what's supposed to be his face like trapped in the television. Yeah, it's such an iconic part of the thing. And I love in the Lloyd interview with Ernest, when Lloyd says, "Where did that idea come from?" And he just basically says, "That came right from Videodrome." Like,
I'm actually going to play a little bit of that interview.
That design, the whole effect where Kadeem is sucked into the television.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That whole thing.
It's a beautiful effect. It's an amazing effect too, especially in its day.
Yeah,
I mean, I've still never seen anything like that.
We did it very, very simply, actually. I had a shell of a television made, and had instead of the screen, I had a piece of rubber, of white rubber, and then with a 16 millimeter camera, I pre-shot some stuff of Kadeem making funny gestures at the camera. And then later on, we put it in a projector, and actually front projected it right onto the rubber, so it looked like it was the television screen. And then we had somebody behind the screen pushing it out, making it look like it's alive.
Joel then wakes up next to the naked succubus, and Sam Jackson appears, and he starts yelling at him, calling him a fornicator and a sinner. And
it happens when he wakes up. It seems like he's in his childhood room.
Yes. Before he goes to New York, he's in, North Carolina, I believe?
Yep, North Carolina, where they take their shirts off, twist them around their hands, spin it like a helicopter.
Yes. And then, and so he's back in North Carolina, because we see his grandma, also there with Sam Jackson. And then the succubus does like a force push, like a Jedi force push, and knocks over grandma. The succubus breaks Joel's wrists, and it looks pretty rough. Like she just snaps his hand back, and it's gross. And she tries to strangle Grandma, and Joel goes for his Bible and cross as Sam Jackson's preaching, and then you just have a light of the cross on the succubus, and then her head turns into a creature from Sergeant Kabuki Man NYPD and explodes. So,
Gotta love Troma's recycling because Kabuki Man was shot the year before this, but it was released the year after. But then it took 6 years for both to release a Troma Team video release. So
I actually and kind of some interesting stuff about this is so Ernest Dickerson shot probably 99% of this movie, and the 1% he didn't shoot, Lloyd shot, which would explain where the Kabuki Man head came from. I actually have an audio clip I'm going to play with Lloyd and Ernest Dickerson talking about the pickup shots that Lloyd did.
I went on to another job. And then next thing I knew,
it was a hiatus. It's closed down.
I think it did close down, and then there were some pickup shots of a beast that came in later. I didn't shoot those.
Who was the cinematographer on the Beast and the climatic explosion that had to match Ernest Dickerson's artistry? Who was the DP on that?
I don't know.
Another interesting point for me personally is that Ernest Dickerson, the director of photography, had to leave Death by Temptation because he was becoming a major cinematographer and director of photography and ultimately an award-winning director. So I became the director of photography for the very last climactic scene with our friend down here. And my miserable director of photography abilities rose to the occasion because nobody has ever noticed that there is a difference between the Ernest Dickerson brilliant work in Death by Temptation and my rather traumatic work.
One of the most stressful, although I've been one of the more stressful events of my life. We had very little money, and we had to finish your movie. Mm-hmm. We had to mix it and get reshoot. We had to reshoot some stuff, and James wanted interstitial stuff, and so I had to be the DP on that that big scene at the end with we made that monster thing, and
that was you. Okay.
And I was really paranoid that you'd look at the movie and then you'd say, "Whoa, this is terrible! I'm going to sue those bastards, that cheap Kaufman." But hopefully it was okay then.
Yeah, it cuts in.
So it didn't. We tried to we deconstructed as best we could your lighting, mm-hmm. and tried to imitate it as much as we could. But again, I'm not I do my own camera work, but I'm definitely not a master. I'm no Stanley Cortez or Ernest Dickerson. That is for sure. So I was really worried. I mean, I don't worry about too many things, but I was worried about fucking with somebody's art, and when nothing happened, I was like, whew.
Well, if I remember correctly, I think it's a tight close-up of the beast, right?
Well, there was other stuff in there too, but we tried to keep it as close as we possibly. We tried to keep it to have the least number of errors as possible.
I think he also wrote a bit about it in his book as well, and his own nerves about how word is going to ruin the film.
Which I don't think if I didn't know. Mm-hmm. You can't tell that somebody else shot the last little bits. It looks just as good, which I think that's something that people do forget about Lloyd, is that he is a filmmaker. Mm-hmm. So, and I think he even forgets that about himself too. He's a really good filmmaker when he gets the chance to be. So mm-hmm. The Kabuki Man monster explodes. There's green slime and smoke everywhere. And then Joel hugs his Grammy, and then we see a limo pull up outside that New York bar, and Kay is now a vampire, or a succubus, or demon,
Wolfman, mummy. No, but yeah, I'd say demon because he has the 2 rows of fangs. So
that's true.
Yeah,
and Dougie is also a demon in the end of Death by Temptation. That movie it's so good. I want to watch it again after we're done recording.
I do too. Like, and that's one too where I mentioned when I would copy Troma movies like on VHS for friends. Like, Death by Temptation was the one most people would ask for, and probably that and Cannibal were the two things that potentially got more people into Troma in my high school than otherwise would have probably wanted to check for it. And I remember like the day, like my very last day of 8th grade, going to Cheapo Records in Fridley, Minnesota, and finding a used copy of the Death by Temptation soundtrack on CD from Orpheus Records. Boom, baby.
I got the soundtrack. There was a record store out here called Atomic Records, and James Bond, I live in Denver, and James Bond the third, he lives in Colorado Springs, which is like an hour away. So when I went to Atomic Records, they had this box of Death by Temptation, which I imagine was probably him cleaning out his garage and being like, I don't need a whole case of Death by Temptation CDs. So he probably sold it to him. And they had a bunch of them for $1. And I kicked myself for only buying one. It's like I should have just bought all of them, because it would have
opened
been
a
like
theme restaurant, like for that many copies of it. Like,
you have like the everything's terrible Jerry Maguire things. I could have had the Death by Temptation soundtracks. But so you said On a Mission was your favorite track on there?
Yeah. It's I think like for whatever reason, the mixing on the CD, it sounds better on the. It's a little weirdly low, like volume wise, some of the mixing on that track on the CDs, as opposed to like when you hear it in the film itself. And so I don't know what happened between the soundtrack release and the film release, but yeah, that's my favorite song on it.
One of my favorites is Sex in the Single Man on there.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you brought up the soundtrack, because it is a really good soundtrack. And I see it pop up on eBay all the time, so it's something that everyone should pick up and add to their Troma soundtrack collection.
Because I mean, let's say like up to the year 2000, you only like on CD, you only had like 5, like not including compilations and like the Talk to in Tromaville, but there were only like 5 movies that had like Troma CD soundtracks, right? You had Death by Temptation, Stendhal Syndrome, Decapitated, Terra Firma, and Romeo and Juliet. And then you had Citizen Toxie in 2002. But I'm trying to, was there another CD release that
not that Troma put out, but there was the Cannibal the Musical that the Crap site put out. And they also put out, which I can't find like any evidence of anywhere, but I know it exists because it was stolen out of my friend's car, was Cannibal the Musical. It was like 2 tracks, but it had like Shatterproof and I think something else like a demo version of like When I Was on Top of You or something.
Or no, because there was another song that was cut from Cannibal that I think was the track 2 on that. The We're All Gonna Die song or something like that, or
it was just like a 2-track thing. And now the Cannibal the Musical CD is like goes for like $300 on like Discogs, and it's like I'm never gonna get that again. So
it's also the Discogs have-nots prices. Because I remember like the crap.tv site that Jason McHugh had it for it was like those 2 tracks, but they wanted like $25 or $35 for 2 tracks, which in 2000 money equates to about $300 today. So that sounds about right.
But yeah, well, any final thoughts on Death by Temptation?
It's just a phenomenal film. I know we're gushing on it a lot, but it's just such a wonderful movie, and there's a reason why it's held up for as long as it has, and the themes that it touches on, and there's so much that it touches on that are still relevant today. And I wrote my NYU Cinema Studies thesis on Black horror films and the entire history of the Black horror genre. And Death by Temptation in particular came out at a time when there really was something of a drought of Black horror films. And there's so much that it just touches on and captures of that era. And I think now, because we're going to transition now to talking about what we double feature it with. So in that same vein, like the only other movie it really gets compared to is Vampire in Brooklyn, which, and it's in some like hip hop circles, if you want to start a debate, say what's better, Death by Temptation or Vampire in Brooklyn, because you'll get strong feelings on both sides of it. And I think it definitely it shows that there is an audience who cares about this film and these themes and this particular style. And it's wonderful this film exists, and that it's wonderful that Vinegar Syndrome put out such a worthwhile, proper release of it. So yeah, it's a good movie. I love it.
Yeah, and everyone, it's like at the time of recording, it's on Troma now. It's also on Shudder. So, there's no excuse. You should definitely track it down and watch it. It's definitely worth your time. All right, so it's double feature night at your theater. What movie are you picking?
When it came time to choose what I wanted for my double feature, initially I wanted to do, because like I said, this movie is compared so often with Vampire in Brooklyn, and no disrespect to Vampire in Brooklyn, but for how thoughtful this podcast is, I didn't want to just rehash and like revisit the discourse of Vampire in Brooklyn versus Death by Temptation that always seems to echo around either film. And so initially I wanted to do a movie which was part of the early 2000s, like 99, 2000, 2001 rush of direct-to-video black horror films. But that movie itself, I'm not going to mention the name of it because who knows, we may do it on a future episode. While it does have certain elements of it that are interesting and worthwhile, it's nothing I can say is like legitimately as great of a film as Death by Temptation. So I wanted to do another black horror film that I think is just a phenomenal masterwork. So I went with the 1976 film JD's Revenge.
Going guy with a good-looking woman, but something awful's gonna happen. There's big trouble coming. It's JD's Revenge.
Good gin cleanses your soul out. Listen, man, ain't nothing wrong with my soul.
There was a real mean killing, and the wrong guy died. They buried his body, but his soul survived. For JD's Revenge.
Lately, I've been getting these headaches, I've never felt this lost before in my life.
You beat me up. I
don't remember doing any of those things. Maybe something is happening to me.
The reincarnation of a killer who came back from the dead to possess a man's soul, make love to his woman, and get the vengeance he craves.
I'm flipping out.
He's my baby sister, Betty Joe. You my baby sister, Betty Joe. They are my enemies.
They're my enemies.
There's one weird nigger.
I'm cracking up, man. I blacked out.
Glenn Turman, the star of Cooley High.
What in the world have you done to yourself?
I ain't seen a get up like that in 25 years.
Yeah.
Joan Pringle.
My business is where? Theotis.
Lou Gossett.
There is no danger, Theotis.
This nigga's crazy. I'm the craziest nigga you ever gonna meet. Yay!
He wasn't himself.
Don't nobody talk to me like that.
He turned into this monster, a whole other person.
Scared of your daddy.
Well, there is something wrong with Ike. Tonight he kept saying he was this J.D. Walker.
J.D. Walker's been dead for over 30 years.
It's J.D. Walker.
What the hell do you mean J.D. Walker is back? This boy is possessed by the spirit of J.D. Walker.
Oh, you're a jackleg preacher now, Elijah.
What's J.D.'s voice?
There's that good for nothing brother of yours.
And his manner?
I got score to settle with him.
You were possessed.
Notice killed Betty Joe.
40 years later, on someone else's face, you can see J.D. Walker's hatred time just won't erase. J.D.'s Revenge.
I'll have my revenge.
Nice.
Yeah. JD's Revenge is the film I first saw at NYU in a class with recently retired fabulous professor Ed Guerrero, no relation. And we screened this and it blew me away. When people think of like a lot of the blaxploitation horror classics, they think, things run typically on a scale from Blackula, which is fantastic, to Blackenstein, which is a great idea with not the best execution. And JD's Revenge is really in a class all of its own. You have underworld crime lord in 1940s New Orleans who is murdered, and his soul comes back in the 1970s, inhabiting the body of a mild-mannered law student cab driver when he's hypnotized in a New Orleans lounge act. And so you have a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde element to it. Not to be confused with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Black, where a white guy turns black or a black guy turns white. This is very much where you see, and what's unique about this film too is you don't see a lot of black horror, black exploitation films that show that sort of nostalgia or tribute or tying back to 1940s era. And when you have that directly contrasting with when you see 1940s style versus 1970s style, it's just such a cool mashup in that regard. And the reason why I think it plays so well as a double feature with Death by Temptation is they both deal so heavily with religious themes and black spirituality, because the person who JD wants his revenge with in possessing this person is someone who was at one point underworld kingpin, who's since become the manager of someone who's a radio evangelist for profit. And there's a lot of really interesting, compelling turns that speak to the spiritual side of it without at any point being corny or contrived or heavy-handed, and instead follow a very believable route. And you also have just fantastic performances by Lou Gossett Jr. and Glenn Turman,
who he's also in a different worlds with Kadeem Hardison.
Yep, boom, the connection there. And it was directed by Arthur Marks, who Troma fans will know for doing underrated but phenomenal Troma film Centerfold Girls in '74, which he did in the middle of doing a run of blaxploitation films like Detroit 9000 and Bucktown. So yeah, I highly recommend everyone check out JD's Revenge.
The couple Troma references connections I did find. So Bob Miner, who plays the husband, he does stunts for Maniac Cop 2. Which is now a Troma movie, and that still feels weird to say. But other Troma connections I found, I guess on like the weird dub stuff. So George Folsey Jr., he edited JD's Revenge, but he's also the editor and producer of Schlock, aka the Banana Monster, that Troma put out and then I think got in trouble for putting out.
Because he is a frequent collaborator of Landis, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
They did like Blues Brothers together and all that stuff. And then Rhonda Shear, she played the 1942 girl, and she's in Assault of the Party Nerds Part 2. She does an interview on the Make Your Own Damn Movie box set, and she just introduced so many people to Troma movies on USA Up All Night. You kind of have to mention her when she's around in a Troma conversation.
Wait, hold up. Assault of the Party Nerds?
Part 2.
Part 2 was a Troma movie?
Yeah, I actually have a promotional condom for that.
Well, because the first one wasn't. Like, the first one was not Full Moon, but like the proto Full Moon. Or was the first one a Troma?
I'm not sure about that.
Because I know because the nerd movies Troma put out were Killer Nerd, Bride of Killer Nerd, Nerds of a Feather.
And this one's not even mentioned in Lloyd's book. The only reason I do know is I just acquired a Troma condom for Assault of the Party Nerds too. So
the first one, I want to say if not Full Moon, or what was the same company who put out Sorority Babes and Slide Ball Bolorama? Because the actor
Empire.
from Galactic, what
was it? Is Empire, I think, right?
I think so. Yeah, because the same actor from Galactic Gigolo is in Assault of the Party Nerds, and there's so much between that and like the Assault of the Bimbo movie rush, like Assault of the Killer Bimbos, and all the ones that got like bits and pieces taken for Bimbo Movie Bash, that proto mashup movie, which I wonder how that holds up now. It's the one that I think aesthetically may play better now than it did at the time, but who knows? It could also be misogynistic, toxic masculinity at its absolute worst. So, of which JD's Revenge does a fantastic, ahead of its time job critiquing. And just in the same way that I think Death by Temptation does a really interesting analytical eye at the overtones of religion and vengeance and unnecessary exclusion that the corruption of religion can issue. I think a lot of JD's Revenge shows how the corruption that can come from organized religion, as well as just in terms of society. And when you see just the toxic masculinity shown in different parts from whether, and the distrust of mental health, when you have someone actually looking to reach out about their own mental health problems, and a lot of the medical industry people at the time are just, not acknowledging it. And I think for some of the critiques that the film has about mental health, or about toxic masculinity, but it's never portrayed in a positive light. And you also hear his best friend gets into saying, I wish I would have listened. I wish I could have helped him because he was asking for help this whole time. I think it's way ahead of the curve in terms of, addressing a lot of these things that are so much more potent today.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen it, but I need to revisit it. I know Arrow put a Blu-ray of it out not too long ago, so
that's the one I watched, and it's awesome. And even the essay on the inside of it is really well done. And one of the features on it is the radio spots, one of which is for a double feature with Coffee. My favorite
awesome
beer film. So yeah,
mine too. I have a signed Coffee poster hanging up in my stairway. I love that. Well, for my double feature, I decided to go with the 1974 film directed by William Girdler, Abby.
This was Abby. This was Abby. A woman loved and in love until that night when something evil came looking for a soul to possess.
I can't stop thinking about your husband.
That creep, forget him. Was this Abby? Now the fun starts.
Grab her! Hold her! Hear me, demon! Leave this woman's body!
Abby, rated R.
So this movie is, if you just want to do a 2-word synopsis of the movie, Black Exorcist could have been an alternate title of it, because they definitely lift very heavily from Exorcist.
Yeah, and this was the only Exorcist knockoff that actually had legal action taken towards it. So for a very, very long time, it was impossible to find in the United States. I never saw a physical copy of this movie until I visited Toronto in 2015. I saw it in a video store and I was taken aback.
So same here. I've never seen a physical copy, and I did a little bit of wandering around trying to figure out what movie I wanted to do a double. At first I was thinking maybe Petey Wheatstraw came to mind at first, but Abby just seemed like it felt right, and I was looking for it, and I found a physical copy on eBay, but then it got stolen out of my mailbox. So as far as I know,
whoa, dude, no.
I know. So, and I feel bad for the seller because it's not his fault that I didn't get it. So I'm not going to give him a bad review or nothing. So it's well,
oh, man, that sucks. Man, that's awful.
So I watched a version of a movie with already dubious legal things. I watched a dubious version on YouTube, and the quality on it was not great, but it was good enough to enjoy just a nice kind of blaxploitation movie. And I love William Girdler's movies. On my Frostbiter episode, I doubled Frostbiter with the movie he did, The Manitou. And this is his take on The Exorcist. William Marshall, who's Blackula, he is the main priest, and it's about a priest and his wife she becomes possessed when Blackula releases a demon from a statue in the Middle East. So it's very much just like The Exorcist. There's not too much different other than it's, a full-grown woman instead of a child. And she doesn't, she goes around having sex with other men and killing them before the main exorcism takes place. So if you could track it down, it's just a wonderfully made movie. And
any reason to go to Canada? The borders are open now. Just go on an Abbey pilgrimage to Toronto, the happiest place on earth.
Yes,
and rent Abbey.
And yeah, you just need to have more William Girdler movies in your life.
get some poutine and some girdling.
That exactly. And the Troma connections I found on that one were a whole bunch of the producer was, and the composer and production designer, they all were major players on the Troma movie Project Kill, which stars Leslie Nielsen. So
in a serious role.
Yeah. And so also one worth, I think that one's on Troma now and it's on VHS. I don't ever think it made the jump to DVD, but
no, it's on VHS. It was part of the Before There Were Stars Troma collection that also included,
there's The Wedding Party.
Yeah. Wedding Party with Robert De Niro, Mr. Scarface with Jack Palance, Sizzle Beach USA with Kevin Costner.
There's a Sissy Spacek movie.
Oh, Ellie, but I don't think that was a part of that. That was no, I take that back. No, Ginger in the Morning. You're right.
Yes.
That was Ellie was what's her name? And that was a Troma Collector's Edition release because that actually came out in the 80s. Shelley Winters.
I have the Vestron video of Ellie.
I remember because during the summer that I was really into the first summer rather that I was super into Troma, and my mom knew she'd watched a few of them with me. And so I was watching Ellie, and it has a Troma intro, and then Shelley Winters pops up, and my mom goes, "What's she doing in this?" Shelley had stopped by Tromaville for some fun.
So. That's awesome. Well, I'm sure
I do want to shout out my mom in this too, who brought me to New York so many times and actually went with me on a tour of the Troma studios, and was always very thoughtful and. At an age when, I think a lot of parents would have not shown their children what these movies are, perhaps tried to hide things or dissuade them. My mom was always very encouraging and always kept my foot in reality, but also allowed me to really explore and really enjoy how wonderful these films are, and to, trust to go and to help build these relationships with these different Troma filmmakers and have these experiences. And I just want to publicly say I love my mom so much.
I love that your mom let you into Tromaville.
Even when one time we went in summer 2001 when Lloyd was at a different convention. So it was my mom, and then Doug Sackman, Millie Medina, rest in peace, and giving my mom and I a full tour of the whole Troma building. And I'm 14, about to turn 15, and it was just so cool. And and just my mom always being down. And I was a junior, senior in high school. Junior, it was 2003. And my school's the theater kids. We took a drama theater sponsored trip to New York. And even though, when you go on school trips, the things usually decided what to do, Statue of Liberty, Empire State Building, blah, blah, blah. I said, hey, we could go see this actual movie studio that's in New York. So, so the school's actually down. So they brought a group of us to the Troma building. Jonathan Lees was there. He was a great dude. And so the private Catholic school, we got to see the penis monster, and great moment. And while we're just on this mind, Troma's done so much for me, and Lloyd, I'm sure for you too, and for me, and just Lloyd gives so much of his time and expects nothing in return. And he's such a jump off inspiration for so many people. And I think what I've always viewed of the Troma team, and he really does treat it like a team, is it's essentially somewhat like how Andy Warhol treated The Factory, except there wasn't that level of elitism with it. He would bring in and, you know, create his own stars and make people seem like a big deal, which is something when I got into making movies and really in any of my endeavors, whether it was music or whatever, tried to show and, you know, make my friends seem like a big deal who I thought were cool and talented, and find the best ways to accentuate their positives and obscure their negatives. So, you know, and you could see it with how, you know, Troma, even we mentioned, you know, the talents who, you know, had their start with Troma, but you look at the real Troma made stars, like how Troma made a star out of Joe Flyshaker, out of the recently departed Brick Bronski, rest in peace, and Debbie Rashan. There's so much that Troma has done for so many that, you know, give Lloyd his flowers while he's here. You know, give Troma their flowers. Like, because the special thing about all these movies, unlike a lot of other things, is they're going to be around forever. Like Toxic Avenger is always going to be around. Like, for all the, you know, the running joke of, you know, Troma has no money, you know, about to go, you know, these are things that have created global impact, permeating so many different parts of pop culture, that always find a way with arcing themes to be relevant, even if certain parts of it don't seem to quite be as, you know, directly in step with some of the values of today. At its core, the spirit that these movies were made in, the issues these things touched, ultimately the idea of following your heart and making something that you want to see, is something so important. And I just feel really fortunate that having Lloyd and the Troma team as a hero, you know, when you at that age and you decide who your hero is, and having it be someone who was, number one, so accessible, and number two, so encouraging, and so consistent with that. And I know I'm not the only one who has that story, and I know not the only one who feels that way about it. And so, yeah, I'm very thankful that we share a planet with Troma. Movies of the future.
The movies of the future, but now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's like the perfect wrap up for the show. Hey Chaz, where can people follow you on the socials?
Twitter at Chaz Raps, Instagram at Chaz Raps, and where you can type the 8 magic letters at CHAZREPS. You can find me. My music is on all streaming platforms. Anywhere music can be streamed or downloaded or purchased or stolen, you can find me. And yeah, if you're an artist, like, I don't have a radio show at the moment, but if you're making music, whether it's hip hop or whatever, throw it my way. I'd still love to hear it anyway. Still love music. Filmmaker, send me your film. Just, yeah, let's keep making art.
Awesome. And you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Lego Larry. You can follow the show on Twitter at Talkin Troma. And always, stay traumatized.
Poison Ivy League graduate, non-toxic, approximate to advocates. His dinner candlelit, recognize the sense. Decision handler who never rides a fence. Swing a chandelier, the man appears when needed. Off the radar, off repeated, off the page, he's undefeated. The velveteen voice and silk skin, skilled enough to play dealer's choice and still win. A transatlantic romantic who wrote the book on love and then banned it. Every candid looks like a cover art. Reprimanded, but it never dulls the heart. So what's the secret? What's the formula? Conduct himself in public like an orchestra. It's a simple way to give yourself a complex. Embrace the disarray, we're all a work in progress. Give yourself something to look forward to, it's something on the horizon, sunset to ride in. Oh yeah, it's all up, it's all up, just oh yeah. To suggest otherwise is a common lie. Those who fall within your admirable view, it's comparable to how some of your audience sees you. Every different path has different passageways. There's a lot to face en route to the masquerade. And when it gets dark early in the wintertime, be intertwined that you crossed another finish line. Get your plan straight, get a mandate, give yourself a handshake, make pancakes.
Then use pure maple syrup from Polly's Pancake Parlor, 672 Route 117, Cherry Hill, New Hampshire, 03585.
I'm Chaz Kangas. Charles Kaufman's Bread and Sea Bakery are the single greatest cinnamon rolls I've ever had in my life. I swear that is not a joke. Go support the Bread and Sea Bakery. Their cinnamon rolls are fantastic. And while you're snacking on those, keep listening to Talkin Troma with Zack Bynes. I'm Chaz Kangas. I watched Plutonium Baby once, and you're watching.
Yep.
Then just that. Yeah.